What do you want me to say? If you want to say something, I don't want to take away from what you're going to say.
Well, I'm just going to do that. As I understood it,
Okay, so you're not going to explain this special issue?
oh,
You can do that.
I didn't.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
This would make more sense if you did.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It just sort of means that you haven't got to do the housekeeping and all that. I can do all that.
Okay. Great.
Okay, let's vote.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for joining us. If you'd all like to get yourself some coffee, I think some people are still getting some coffee. Take your seats. We will begin this morning's event. I'm Rajesh Merchandani. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Centre for Global Development. I'm very glad to see you all here. Thank you very much for coming. This morning, we are going to be discussing the topic of whether and to what extent there is a statistical tragedy on the continent of Africa. Some of our speakers would seem to refute that. Others might suggest that it is actually the case. That phrase, statistical tragedy in Africa, is quoting another famous economist. This morning, we're going to hear from several speakers, and then there will be time for some questions at the end. We'll wrap up by about 11:30. We will make sure that we have some time for your questions at the end, though. We're going to hear from a couple of people who are going to tell us a little bit about Nigeria's experience in rebasing its GDP. And what that tells us about problems or opportunities for other African countries. We're also going to be hearing from a couple of people who represent major institutions in the development world about what they're doing, their organizations are doing to promote better data collection and generation within countries in Africa. First of all, though, I'd like to introduce Amanda Glassman, who is CGD's Director of Global Health Policy. She'll talk a little bit about this event, about a very special journal issue that's connected, that we're riding on the back of, and also CGD's work in this area. Amanda Glassman, please. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us here today. I'm not wearing my global health hat today. Today, I'm wearing my data hat. And why did I get into this issue? Because when I was looking at the quality of data and I was looking at the household surveys that were available to do research in Africa, I noticed that something like 3/4 of them actually have to do with health and demographic issues, and very little on almost anything else. So even though it may seem strange to have someone from the global health world talking about data and statistics, I can tell you that we have been occupying this area perhaps a bit too much for the past decade or so. So I welcome you. We're really, really honored today to have Dr. Yemi Kale, and Dr. Morten Jerven here as our keynotes this morning. We're here to launch a special issue of the Journal of Development Studies, which has been guest edited by Morten Jerven and by Deborah Johnston. It looks at this idea of the statistical tragedy coined by Shanta Devarajan of the World Bank. I think we should have invited him now that I think about it. He has to face up to that term. But the other thing that's very important to say from the outset is that Africa is not a country. Africa is made up of many different countries, each with their own statistical institutions and realities. And we hope to reflect that as accurately as possible during our talks today. So when we say in our titles and in our report titles, I hope that everyone understands that we're not talking about a homogeneous entity. So without further ado, I just do want to do a plug for the special issue. We have a little handout, and there's open access to the issue here. So please check it out. Please distribute it widely. So let's move on. Dr. Yemi Kale is the Statistician General and the Chief Executive Officer of the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria. He was previously with Stanbic IBTC Bank, at Goldman Sachs, and at Merrill Lynch. And he's also served as a special advisor to the Minister of Finance on domestic and international financial institutions, public policy, and administration, which means he's very well placed to make recommendations to the Washington crowd that also is interested in data in Africa. Okay, so without further ado, Dr. Kale, please. Thanks.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Just to start off by saying that I'm sure that many of my colleagues in the other statistical offices across the country will be very happy to have heard that we are not one entity. We are different countries, and we have different levels of development in different areas, including statistics. But I'm delighted and wish to express my sincere gratitude to the Center for the kind gesture of inviting me to deliver this keynote address at today's meeting. as well as the launch of the special issue of the Journal of Development Studies. As the world approaches the end of the Millennium Development Goals and prepares for a post-2015 development framework, I believe that the importance of timely and reliable official statistics cannot be overemphasized. One does not need to look too far to grasp the importance of ensuring that reliable and dependable data is made available across Africa in addressing national issues. Statistics, as we know, are a vital source of evidence as they provide us with clear, objective numerical data on all aspects of our lives and the state of our country, including the growth and characteristics of our population, economic performance, levels of health and well-being, and the condition of our surrounding environment. Without this, we cannot make well-informed decisions that would catalyze our social and economic development and transform the future. Accordingly, the significance of statistical information for making evidence-based decisions that guide the implementation of new policy, monitoring of existing policy, and evaluation of the effectiveness of policy decisions cannot be overstated. This point, I believe, is especially relevant to African countries because it is when we're able to collate, understand, and interpret data correctly, as well as develop our ability to identify key areas in our society or our economy that require change, that our policy prescriptions and direction are more likely to respond to the needs of our community. I think the timing of this meeting is very auspicious as it coincides with the period of increasing focus on and demand for data and statistical information in Africa. There is undeniably an increasing recognition of the importance of statistics in Africa, leading to an emerging resurgence in the demand for data and statistical information in Africa. If we look at some key data requests, for example, at the Nigerian Statistical Office, for example, in 2005, just fewer than 50,000 reports were downloaded from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics website, compared to over 2 million in 2014. And this doesn't even include requests from people that walk into the office, just online requests. In 2005, the visits on our website were recorded at 36,280, but by the end of 2014, it was nearly 7.5 million hits. And the number of times the Statistics Office was mentioned in the media, which was 73 times in 2005, was over 6,000 by 2014. The sheer number of invitations I've had to honor, including this one, from international investors, multilateral organizations, the media, and so on, in recent times, to discuss statistics, to explain statistics, it's been significant in the last couple of years. And then that's basically emphasizing how much interest there is in data being produced in Nigeria in particular, in the continent in general. So with this obvious increased interest in African data, one might ask the following questions. Where are the numbers? She initially noted that she could find certain types of data, I couldn't find anything else. So where are these numbers, given the huge increase in demand for data from the continent? Is this data poor, as my friend Morten would suggest? Is there a statistical tragedy in Africa? Let me attempt to answer some of these questions by first explaining what I believe is driving this enhanced focus and demand for data in Africa by using Nigeria as a case study. I classify these factors driving the demand for data in Nigeria into two: exogenous factors and endogenous factors. The exogenous factors, which are arguably more dominant, and I'll explain why later, typically involve external data as dictated by conditions occurring outside the country. So as a result of declining growth and business opportunities in most parts of the developed world, several international investors are seeking investment havens elsewhere for opportunities. And of course, as a result, attention is turning to emerging markets in Africa in general. Following the 2008 global financial crisis, growth slowed to an average of less than 2% in the more advanced countries, while many African countries recorded growth of over 5%. I think this is even around that time that the African rising story actually started, mainly because people were looking for other opportunities and were paying more attention to Africa. And that is probably why, because I always ask this question, the attention to data, quality of data, the challenges in statistical office in Africa have always existed. So why all of a sudden are people realizing that there are challenges? They are realizing this because they pay a lot more attention to the continent and everything involving the continent. So the result was a huge inflow of interest and capital into the region. In fact, today, about over 60% of the Nigerian stock exchange is foreign owned, from less than 5% about 10 years ago. At the same time, there's a huge number of international brands that have come into the continent and are now doing business, as have a lot of international development agencies. Foreign investors and development agencies, however, require huge amounts of data to make their decisions, and with this increased interest, African statistical offices have been put under a lot of pressure to meet this demand, and accordingly have been forced to raise the bar higher in the quality and quantity of the data they produce. On the other hand, on the domestic front, data demand is being fueled by what I call endogenous factors. And this is driven largely by an increase in the insistence by the citizens for accountability and good governance, as well as willingness of government at all levels to demonstrate progress and democratic dividends in various sectors. We in Nigeria have just completed successful elections recently, and if we are paying attention, huge parts of the campaign were arguments about data. So the incumbent would comb through all our data to look for all the indicators that looks good and to demonstrate its performance. And of course, the opposition would go into the same database and look for all the indicators that look bad and present it as a case why the current administration needs to be removed. This was never the case historically. Most of Nigeria's history has been military rule. The soldiers don't pay any attention to data. They're not particularly interested in what the data is saying. They rule with force, and they take decisions without any attention to data. And I think this is partly why statistics offices in many African countries actually seem to slow down, because at a time when the military is ruling and not paying any attention to statistical development, you have a gap. Capacities begin to capacities begin to reduce, and all of a sudden you are back into a democratic system and have to build or rebuild the statistical system almost from scratch, because a lot of things have been tossed aside. The funny part is that during the elections, the incumbent would praise the quality of data, which shows it is performing. So in that regard, I'm extremely good at my work. And all the data that makes it look bad, there was some problem with it. It's either forged or badly computed. And the reverse, the opposition would say every data that I publish that makes the government look good, it was badly done. But all the negative data, even though produced by the same person, by the same people, by the same office, is also suddenly done extremely well. And those are part of the interesting challenges of the statistical office in some African countries, including mine. Endogenous demand for data is also being driven by many African countries returning to strategic planning and renewed emphasis on key performance indicators for output and outcomes, rather solely on inputs. So for example, in Nigeria, the public and government are no longer interested in saying we built 100 hospitals, and then looking at whether or not those hospitals were built in the most effective way. They are now asking questions, okay, you built 100 very good hospitals, money was used wisely, but if they are not saving more lives, then as far as they're concerned, then it's a waste of money, even though the hospitals were built and look nice and all the equipments were bought. If health indicators are not improving, then people conclude that the hospitals are a waste of resources. The combination of these exogenous and endogenous factors has created a scenario where there is immense attention and interest in Nigeria and Africa in general as one of the major destinations, and with it has come increased demand for information and consequently significant efforts over the last decade by statistical offices in the continent to improve the quality, timeliness, and reliability of statistics. In Africa and in Nigeria, we are encouraged that statistics is meant to be demand-driven. But the demand in many African countries, including Nigeria, is determined and driven, as I mentioned earlier, mostly by the needs of foreign investors, development agencies, and of course, the government. So the problem you have here is many African statistical offices are poorly funded. The government is only going to be willing to fund the production of that data, the ones that make them look good. So you have more economic statistics, the GDPs, the inflations, and so on, and you have a lot less of the social indicators because they don't want to fund anything that makes them look bad. At the same time, the development agencies are coming in mainly to get the data that they require to do their own jobs. So you have a system that is a data that is driven by external requirements. So the indicators that are actually needed for development, proper development in the country seems to be insufficient. In my opinion, African statistics are not poor, because I believe that the quality of what is actually published has improved significantly. I do not believe that, and that is, I'm taking a risk here because Morten is going to speak after I do, so you have the last word. I do not believe that we are misled, or African statistical offices are misleading users, because I believe, using the word misled, I believe the methodology, the processes used for computation has always been known. For example, using the GDP, the fact that Nigeria was using a GDP base year of 1990 had been known all along. It wasn't something hidden. So how can you say you are misled to use that data? The information that this was 1990 was contained in the document. The methodology that was adopted, whether inappropriate, was also always there. So I don't think, so if you choose to use the data, understanding the methodology that was adopted, I don't think you have been misled. I think you willingly use the information, maybe because you didn't have any better information. So I don't think the use of the word misled is appropriate. While I might agree that there is a statistical tragedy, it isn't so much as a result, in my opinion, of the quality of the data that has been produced, which I repeat, I think has improved significantly over the last decade. But I think the tragedy is more in line with the insufficient quantity of data published to meet a very degree of different data needs. And I think because they have lack of indicators, that tends to make, put the quality of data also under the microscope. When some indicator looks dodgy, you need different sets of indicators to try and explain it. But if you don't have that, those different sorts of indicators, it looks as if the data doesn't make any sense. I'll give an example. When we are trying to, to achieve the MDGs goals for education, universal education, we are tracking net enrollment rates. So of course, if you want to perform as an African country, you have to push up your net enrollment rates. So governments will design policies aimed at pushing up net enrollment rates. But when you do that, and they did that, they try to use cash transfers for any family that brings their children to school, they get some money. And of course, the net enrollment rates shot up significantly. On the face of it, we're doing quite well, education-wise, we're meeting the goals. And then somebody does another study on literacy and finds that literacy rates are extremely low. So somebody says either the net enrollment data is wrong or the literacy rates survey is wrong, because if your enrollment rates are so high, why are your literacy rates so low? Until we decided to track net attendance ratios. And we found that net attendance ratios were very, very low. So parents come to school with their kids, collect their money, and a week after they pull their kids out of school. So you are tracking the wrong indicator of performance. And then these indicators, again, are coming in externally. And because you don't have enough funds, you're not tracking all the indicators you need to explain what might appear to be inconsistencies in the data. So of course, the data is dodgy. So I think the tragedy, in my opinion, is more because there's lack of indicators to actually have a full understanding of what may be going on. I'll give you another example. Using the International Labour Organization's recommendations for computing unemployment, you only have to work for an hour a week to be classified as employed. When we did that in Nigeria, we had unemployment rates of less than 1%. I think that's the best in the world. Because Nigerians are very hardworking. They won't sit back in the house. They will do something for more than an hour a day, and if you just use that as your basis, everybody's employed. That indicator is useless as far as policy is concerned. But for the purpose of international, and I dislike that word, comparison, you have to adopt something that, even if it doesn't really apply to your particular local circumstance. But since you have been funded externally, you have to play whatever tune the funder asks you to. But the data makes no sense. It's not going to help policymakers in Nigeria fix a problem. It will just mislead them. Again, I think that's where the tragedy comes from. The wrong use of indicators that might not suit a particular environment. And Andrew is here. I don't want to pick a fight with him. When we did the last poverty study, for example, a lot of the absolute poverty, I know you have to try and estimate the calorific intake and so on. A lot of the foods that we eat in Nigeria are not on the FAO calorific table. So you have to throw them out because you can't randomly start estimating what's the number of calories in whatever it is. So when you do that, obviously you overstate the poverty because you have thrown out huge amounts of expenditure. So we're having this problem where in the continent, as we are still struggling to meet the current methodologies, we have been introduced to new ones. As we spent so many years and funds and resources trying to fix our national accounts, get our base years, right? And then as soon as we're about to complete, we are hearing that GDP might not necessarily be the best measure of economic activity. And people are working on yet another one. Just as we are finishing sorting that out. Even with poverty, we're measuring poverty using income-based approaches. And as soon as we are trying to sort that out, we are hearing that maybe it's multidimensional indicators that we should be using. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying you're working to get your statistical system functioning using what we call, and again, on that phrase I don't like, international best practice. And then as you're working that, training all your staff, spend a lot of resources, then you hear that, well, you know what you just learned, you have to throw that out. Start all over again, it's a new indicator. So we're always playing catch up. And if you're evaluating us in terms of the latest statistical methodology, we would always have a tragedy. So that's another, in my opinion, another problem with the way the system currently works. I have to move very, very quickly because I can see that I've been here a bit too long. I was going to go into, let me just quickly conclude by saying that I believe the way statistics is funded in many African countries is what is creating that tragedy as it relates to the volume of data produced. I also want to state that in Nigeria anyway, there is no government interference in what we do. That I can state clearly, but not since I've been there for about 3 years anyway. What you may have is states or MDAs publishing their own statistics without falling in line with the official law that says the National Statistical Office should coordinate. So you now see completely different people throwing out different statistics that look confusing. You also see a situation where it is more misapplication of the data as opposed to interfering with the production with data. So I've had, you release some figures that a particular state governor or a particular minister would just not be happy with, and of course he's going to claim that the data wasn't done properly. But there's no interference as far as Nigeria. Our problem is not so much interference, although you can interfere with the office, the work of the Statistical Office indirectly by holding back funding. So I don't want you to, I'm not going to tell you what to publish. I'm going to ask you to twist it around. I just won't give you the funding so you don't have any, you have nothing to publish anyway. So you can interfere with it. We have a bit more of that as opposed to people calling me and telling me what the inflation rate should be this month. We don't have that in Nigeria anyway. I want to conclude by saying that as Africa positions itself along the rest of the world for the post-2015 development framework, it is clear that the role of credible data would be paramount. National statistical offices across Africa would have to ensure that they adopt the most efficient and effective strategies to improve their statistical capacities to meeting the growing demands of governance and development. I want to also use this medium to encourage everyone to support the improvements in African statistics. I believe that the possibilities ahead of us far outweigh the challenges before us. And I think with that, I would just thank you for your patience. I know I went above the 15 minutes I was allotted. Thank you for your patience and your kind attention. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kale. I think those were very important messages for this group about especially new targets, new methodologies, and how they may or may not help with the cause of national development. So now let's turn to Dr. Morten Jerven. He's an associate professor at the Simon Fraser University School for International Studies in Vancouver, Canada. He's published quite widely on African economic development and particularly on development statistics. And he's the author of the book that Dr. Kale mentioned, Poor Numbers: How We Are Misled by African Development Statistics and What to Do About It, which I think we could say at minimum reignited debates on measurement and the importance of statistics in Africa. So without further ado, Dr. Jerven.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, Amanda, and thank you for helping to put this forward and being positive to putting this event on. Thank you to the center as well for organizing this, and to, of course, my co-panelists from the World Bank and IMF, and particularly to Yemi Kale for this excellent first keynote here. Today I will tell you a little bit about, try to, for some of you, to talk a little bit through that narrative around Africa's statistical tragedy. Where did it come from? And I will suggest today that I take Africa's statistical tragedy take 2. So where are we now? Because it's a kind of a slow narrative which has been unfolding, maybe partly based in, unhealthily, perhaps based in Washington, D.C. and so forth, and an exchange here. And it's, you know, we're talking 5 years now since Ghana Statistical Services updated their benchmark from 1993 to till 2006 and kind of launched this thing. And I will also suggest that I agree fully to what Yemi Kale talked about, who is being misled by whom. And a large part of my argument is that indeed it is institutions here in Washington, D.C., scholars across the world, particularly in Western Hemisphere, who is forgetting to use data as if they are facts, as if they're coming out of the thin air. So the kind of what we want to do with this particular special issue is to refocus attention to the institutions that produce this data. And so to encourage everyone who use this data, whether you're working at a desk at the IMF or whether you're writing your doctoral thesis at a university in California, to always be doing your job properly. Well, that means asking yourself, where did this observation come from? Who made this observation? Under what conditions was this observation made? Is there any reason to believe that there were particular circumstances that constrains this observation and its use in where I'm going forward? And I think Kale called it correctly. One of the hard part is actually that to do, because of the nature of the data, and because it changes according to global standards, but not so much what is appropriate for local measures, that makes it difficult to do your job properly like that, although that's no excuse. And also because of the nature of the data availability, which makes it harder to triangulate and to make sure, how do I make sense of this primary school enrollment rate and so forth like that. So I think that's the challenge. So where does this Africa statistical tragedy come from? On the 5th of November 2010, Ghana Statistical Services announced that their GDP for the year 2010 was revised up to 45 billion cedi, and this compared to 26 billion cedi. And it's appropriate that we are here at the Center of Global Development because Todd Moss wrote one very good blog post the next day and say, boy, we really don't know anything. And he moved on to point on to the fact, the day before this revision, Ghana was a poor country. The day after it was an IDE graduate. It also moved on to say that, hang on a minute, if this could happen in Ghana, in front of our eyes, and everyone seems to be surprised in Washington, D.C., what do we then know about other countries? It was then that Shanta Trevarjan called this Africa statistical tragedy, using, I think, a clever metaphor from the growth tragedy by William Easterly, but as I will argue in the following, I think he used the wrong metaphor. He should have gone for the lost decades. That would have been more historically correct. And I, of course, then contributed in my modest way by publishing poor numbers, how we're misled by African development statistics, and what to do about it. And it's, as Kale as well pointed out, it's remarkable how much more attention media, scholars, economists, and so forth are willing to give African development statistics. If anything, quality is better now than it ever has been. Yeah, that depends on the indicator you're looking at and so forth like that. But so it's a broad, misleading statement, perhaps. But it was interesting that when I published my book, Poor Numbers, it was reviewed in the Financial Times. And I can tell you, when I started out doing my PhD research on quality of economic statistics in year 2006, no one would have thought that that made it to some kind of headline kind of material. People wondered how I could conceive of such a boring PhD dissertation topic. But it turns out it became quite exciting and interesting because the chief economist of the African Development Bank, not only did he read the review of the poor numbers in the Financial Times, but actually made the effort of writing a response to the book review in the Financial Times, saying, wait a minute, don't worry, investors, Africa's rise is real. Come and look for yourself. Because there was, of course, that point as well. If you say, okay, our economies have been growing 10%, 12%, and so for all years, and then someone comes along and says, not all of these numbers are as good as you would like to think, then, what is the informational premium investors are paying? And, how bad can the statistics be before they'll start either asking for bigger returns or withholding their investments altogether? And I think we still see that particular dynamic playing out, actually. And that's a very important topic to be watching. As a response as well, in both IMF Regional Outlook Report in 2013 and the African Development Bank, in May and April, both published an analysis of what were the benchmark years, what were the base years, and so forth, basically replicating what I had done in poor numbers 2 years earlier. Very interesting that in that same month, IMF and African Development Bank managed to publish a table of benchmark years in use in Africa, and their tables didn't match up, which tells us a little bit as well about the knowledge problem as well. If you read the African Development Bank and the IMF report published in the same month, you wouldn't know which of the benchmark was in use for GDP in Madagascar. So there is clearly, not only does some of the data don't flow the way it should, but also the metadata doesn't go as it should. So then, of course, in 2014, 6th of April, then if someone thought this was over, then Yemi Kale announced in Abuja new GDP numbers. And in that, if Ghana made a lot of headlines, Nigeria certainly did, because it also meant that Nigeria suddenly overtook South Africa as the biggest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. And there was a lot of, I think a lot of the financial journalism at that point was better, because at least they learned between 2010 to 2014 what a benchmark is and what a rebasing is and so forth like that. So again, I agree with Kale, a lot of this is not consulting what is the methodology and so forth like that, but it was a confusing statistical news, which I think many observers now have worked through and understand a bit more than we did before. And of course, in 2014, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Uganda also followed suit and re-benchmarked their GDPs and had increases not on the line as big as the ones in Nigeria. 25-30% or so forth was the average across, which also reflect the fact that they were not going back as far back as to 1990 to read all their calculations, but were only updating their knowledge picture by about 10 years. By the way, it's interesting to remind ourselves that IMF recommends to do this every 5th year. And if you go back and think about, we're still talking about Africa's statistical tragedy originating in Ghana when they rebased to a 2006 base year. So they're close to a decade old, that base year there already. So the challenge of keeping up here is clear for everyone to see. Now, so what's my take too on Africa's statistical tragedy? I think that if there was a tragedy unfolding, it must be the personal tragedy of those observers who were sadly not able to know how little they knew. That the tragedy were those who think that these were facts and didn't use these numbers correctly and ask themselves. Well, everyone who knows a little bit about economic statistics knows that these are all approximations, generalizations, based methods on data, on the definitions available, and depending on the mismatch between the complex social reality and the odd gaps and holes you have in your Excel sheet, the bigger the the potential for being misled is. The danger and the tragedy is we forget this. Yeah, if you think that these are just facts. And I think that it was perhaps a tragedy that it was discovered so late. And that's where I'm saying that when he used Easterly's metaphor, I think he should have used the one of lost decades. Because what he was referring to was a knowledge problem that had been unfolding in the 1980s and 1990s, where not only government expenditure were curtailed in different ways, but also statistical offices that found themselves very short in funding, also had much bigger challenges to make account of the economies that looked radically different following structural adjustment, liberalization, political change, and so forth like that. So is there perhaps then not a tragedy, but rather a statistical renaissance? That is another metaphor has been used. Beware that statistical renaissance, refers to, well, the Italian Renaissance, I suppose, which also then presupposes some kind of dark ages, some Middle Ages, which then Africa is re-emerging from. So it's also an unhealthy metaphor in many ways, although it seems to have a more positive spin. I think there's progress has definitely been uneven, but in some fields, astonishing, like such as the last population census round in Africa is the most successful one on record. Yeah, for the first time, more people are being counted since the 1960s. After really having a lower and lower participation in the 70s and 80s, we're now looking up and upwards there. But progress has been uneven, and partly that is because a lot of the investment, a lot of the demand is also uneven as well, so that we might have been more interested in finding out what's going on with social indicators because they mattered for donors. But until recently, getting inflation statistics right, getting GDP statistics right, getting unemployment statistics right has not been that important. It's now becoming, as these countries are entering capital markets and so forth, and what exactly the premium they're paying on that informational shortage at the moment is anyone's guess. I think that the rebasings and, of course, the news which is written about them reflect more how long economic statistic has been neglected. But we might actually start, I think, and hope we're seeing the beginning of this here, for a healthy, broader discussion of the production of statistics with scholars, with statisticians, and with international organizations taking an important role, together with all the stakeholders such as investors and citizens and so forth like that. So that's where the special issue, Statistical Strategy in Africa, evaluating the database for African economic development comes in. It's Deborah Johnson and I who have, we wanted first to do a follow-up on that special issue in the journal Development Economics, edited by Srinivasan in 1994. For some of you who are, will know that in the 1990s, then suddenly we had a rush of online available data sets at the time. You had the Penwell tables, World Development Indicators after a while, first on magnetic tapes, but then on CD-ROMs and so forth like that, which unleashed unknown possibilities for scholars to do all sorts of global comparisons. And at the moment, this special issue then had a particular focus on how can we use population statistics in Nigeria compared to one in India and Argentina. Does it make sense and so forth like that? And we wanted to follow up on that. This special issue falls in line with, is a result of a conference organized in Vancouver in April 2013, where in addition to poor numbers being launched, we heard 36 papers. Yemi Kale was there as well, giving one paper. Part of this, we have some of the papers are published in this particular issue. Others are published in, and also as a book by Routledge called Measuring African Development, Past and Present. So this is part now of close to 20 papers coming in on this reflection on the knowledge problem in African development statistics. In the special issue, which I then, again, if you don't know how to access it online freely, then you can consult the flyers which are circulated. Also, if you look up on my website or my Twitter account and so forth, you'll find this. It has an introduction. It also has a paper by Justin Sandefur and Amanda Glassman here at the Center of Global Development called The Political Economy of Bad Data, Evidence from African Survey and Administrative Statistics, a comparison of data. What do you find in surveys and how does it correspond with statistics? And importantly, how does the administrative statistical system respond when you get this kind of very clearly defined incentive rewards for saying if the statistics shows higher enrollment, we'll give you more money. So how does the statistical system respond to that? We have Jolliffe et al. Summarizing the knowledge problem in agricultural statistics. Sarah Randall and Ernestina Coast does a different kind of take, which is actually asking what is the use of the household as a definition and how much are we missing out when we pick the household. As many will know, there was a rich debate in the 50s and 60s, everyone agreeing that the household is probably not appropriate in the 1960s, and then but the time came, and then Ghana was supposed to do the first household budget survey, and then everyone asked themselves, okay, so which unit should we use? The household, because there was no particular other alternative. You had to go with the global standard, and we're still stuck with that. But it's worth asking yourself, what are the knowledge problems for men? Matteo Rizzo and co-authors engages with a very important problem as well. This also Yemi Kale referred to, labor statistics. How do you define informality? How do you define if someone is economically active or not? And they're looking at particularly the case of Tanzania. Also misunderstanding between how you translate a survey form from English to Kiswahili, which is also part of local standards. Statistics is it's a global language, and it has, of course, be translated to local setting. Abebe Shimeles and Mutuli Kube of the African Development Bank tries to measure the size of the African middle class. because we have one of the big problems about this as well is data availability. You don't have enough household service across and so forth. They don't measure all of these things, so they use the DHS data to try to come up with a different kind of metric. And finally, I'd like to draw your attention to the article which I have co-authored with Yemi, Kale, with Magnus Ebba Duncan, previously of the Ghana Statistical Service, and now retires this year, Deputy Director of Statistics in Zimbabwe, all writing reports about the difficulties of introducing a new benchmark of the economy and the historical aspect of the struggles of these institutions. Let me just summarize by saying a few things about, again, to generalize a little bit from the special issue which we present today, but also research on this. I think the work of quizzing and contesting statistics is very important. Part of that kind of work is triangulation. So you'll see a lot of the papers which we're doing here does the easiest thing, which is to compare, how does the growth data for Nigeria look in Penwell tables and how does it look like at the World Bank? Look, they're different, that kind of stuff. But also more advanced saying like, okay, how does labor statistics look like in Tanzania if you ask questions differently? And if you do use different surveys, if you ask people in the beginning of the month and the back of the month, do you get different kind of poverty data and so forth? So a lot of important work there, triangulation, trying to find out which standard works and which doesn't. And also by comparing big data sets with each other, you can see, hey, someone did a mistake there. Mistakes are also good to weed out, It's also another way of contesting and quizzing statistics is to contest categories, to take issue with definitions. And I think this is very important, comes out in the work on poverty, household, labor, and so forth. It is a shortcoming of all global comparative statistics that you have global standards, but they don't always gel very well with local conditions and local metrics. And so to understand, this should be, it should be an engagement kind of communication. I think I've written this book called Poor Numbers, How We're Misled by African Development Statistics. One could also potentially write a book called Rich Numbers, how our statistical knowledge is enriched by studying conditions in low-income countries. Because there is a lot of very good work about trying to figure out how to come up with new survey ways and so forth like that. And a lot of the using big data for measuring living standards, a lot of that groundwork is being done in what we refer to as the Global South, for instance. But of course, I also want to take the more difficult step is to genuinely approach statistics as products and not as facts. And that means that reminding you that valid statistics does not mean accurate statistics. The word validity comes from power. It comes from legitimacy. It comes from credibility. So when you are calculating the total size of the Nigerian population, for instance, you're not producing a mathematical fact. You're establishing a social fact. And that means your credibility and who trusts you and so forth like that. And I also invite people to think about that. Why do we trust some numbers and others not? And part of this getting rid of the African statistical tragedy and firmly launching some kind of statistical renaissance, I also believe it is about firmly establishing the legitimacy of these statistical offices in the African region, but also other places, to have that role to be there as the producer of statistics. Many scholars out there do hesitate to use statistics from the official statistic because they think it is politically tampered with, but at the same time have no such hesitation of downloading exactly the same number from the IMF as if it is somehow different. And I think these things are what we need to really tackle. So if there is a data revolution in development forthcoming, that's not as simple as counting everybody. Statistics is not only about knowledge, it's about governance. And as we also talked, statistical independence is not only about legal independence, it's about functional independence, how to work in the global demand for development statistics, but also in the legal and funding aspects of it. I think I'll stop there and thank you very much.
Are you going to introduce the panel?
Thank you very much to both our speakers for very interesting presentations. We're going to bring you a couple of more speakers straight away. one from the World Bank, one from the International Monetary Fund. Let's start off by inviting Andrew Dabalan, who's the lead economist for the World Bank Africa region, to the podium. Mr. Dabalan is a lead economist in the World Bank's Africa region. He focuses on policy analysis and research of micro-development issues related to poverty and social impact, as well as inequality of opportunity, program evaluation, risk and vulnerability. I'm really keen to hear your thoughts, so if you'd like to come up to the podium to share them with us. I'm particularly interested to hear what your organisation is doing to improve data collection in African countries and what you made of the presentations you heard.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the Center for Global Development. I'm delighted to be here. I wasn't actually supposed to be here. I want to send my regrets, my chief economist regrets, Francisco Ferreira, who's the chief economist for Africa region, who was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, for family reasons, he couldn't be here. But nonetheless, I'm extremely delighted. I'm happy to be here. I have been involved in some of the conferences in Vancouver on these issues. I have been doing a lot of research and a lot of operational work in trying to improve African statistical quality and volumes. I'm delighted that we're having this discussion. So now, look, the kind of statistics you could end up talking about is obviously enormous, right? We have administrative statistics. We have a lot of the statistics that most of you use, which is statistics that are collected through surveys or censuses from populations, right? I don't have a lot of expertise on administrative statistics, so I wouldn't be able to say anything meaningful about that, except what I believe the broad principles should be, and which I think we all share. But I do have some experience working on these other statistics, particularly on surveys, household surveys. I work a lot with micro data sets, so that's something I can speak to with a bit more credibility than I would speak to about, say, GDP. But just to preface this by saying that, in fact, the improvements in the quality of statistics in Africa, before we all get into the festival of actually this critique of African statistics, right? Which is always very exciting and always very enticing. I should say that, in fact, the improvement in African statistics started a long, long time ago. Started in the mid-90s, right? And you can see that in the volumes and the quality of especially what I look at, which is household surveys, right? Back in the 90s or before that, we would have at most 90 surveys in any 5-year period. Starting from around mid-90s to about 2000, we'll be talking almost double that, and has been going at that level, almost flat. We'd like to see that increase, of course, but that has been a huge improvement in terms of volumes. And even we talk about GDP, even that has changed enormously in the last 10 years or so. A lot more countries now actually have rebased their GDPs. About 20 countries have maybe less than 10 years of GDP base year that is older than 10 years, right, or thereabouts. So we see a lot of improvement. And as Morten said, even the censuses, most countries are actually close to meeting their decennial census obligations. There are a few things like DRCs, which are fragile countries. They have a lot of problems trying to organize their statistical system. So those kinds of countries are always going to be behind. But a lot of them have actually very close to meeting their obligations. And 18 of them, just let me announce this, 18 of them actually have put a lot of their sample censuses online. They are available at this University of Minnesota run international public use micro surveys, which is an improvement than what we done. So I was asked to talk about what we're doing in the World Bank. So I'll stick to that for now, that assignment. So the basic idea is that we can always do more, right? So things have improved. There are lots of gaps. There are lots of problems, but we can improve. And what do we do in the bank to try and do that, to improve the statistical quality and volume of statistics in Africa? So we do three broad things, basically. One is finance. We finance. We finance systems. We finance specific surveys. We finance sectoral data, whether that's education or health, or even just broad institutional reforms of the whole system. We use all kinds of instruments to do this. We use grants. We use loans. Some of you may have heard of these programs called statistical capacity building loans or grants that governments borrow, and that allows governments to actually try and improve their statistical systems over a long period of time, 5, 10 years or so. We use trust funds. We've begun exploring the possibility of using something we call program for results. So this is the idea that the statistical agencies will receive funds for specific results. So if you say the result will be that you do a household survey every 3 years, then that's the result that will be used in order to be able to disburse the money to you. So we are exploring that, and in fact in Kenya they've sort of embraced that idea, and we're having discussions with them about doing that. But there are other countries where we do this. So we do that. There is a new financing facility that the bank is actually exploring in actually trying to improve civil registration and vital statistics. So this is a group of donors that are getting together to create this facility where the governments could receive some seed money in order to be able to improve their registration, civil registration and vital statistics. So this is the censuses, maternal and child health outcomes, and so on and so on. We're discussing the possibility of maybe doing a similar stuff for household surveys. So that's one of the things in the future that we will be exploring and thinking about that. So the second thing we do is technical support in broad speaking terms, in terms of measurement, in terms of design of surveys or any form of statistical indicators, and then also peer-to-peer learning. In some countries, for example, in Southern Africa, where most of the countries are middle income, they've been financing their surveys. The main thing they want is sort of technical assistance in order to be able to actually bring the lessons that say groups like, say a statistical agency like Nigeria have, sort of done well. We can sort of bring those lessons to them, or any other part of the world, right? In terms of implementing surveys. So this is the kind of stuff we do, and so we bring them together into a common thing so that they can learn from each other, but also learn from experts around the world and around the region. And then the final thing we do is obviously innovations, right? In what sense? We do methodological innovations. How do we actually measure consumption better? Is it through a diary? Is it through recall? Should we do these things for 7-day recalls, 2-week recalls? This seems very mundane and very sort of narrowly technical and usual stuff, but they matter a great deal about whether you actually measure something properly and well. So we do these kinds of methodological innovations in terms of just we do this on labor, agriculture, and so on, right? So a wide range of statistics that we really care about that are actually inputs to a lot of things that we use for monitoring progress or development really come down to how well you measure these things. So these are the methodological innovations we bring. We bring innovations also in new technologies. Do we continue to use paper and pencil to collect these data sets, or should we actually go towards using, say, tablets, so that we have much better controls on data entry, so that we minimize a lot of data entry errors at the beginning, at the source, at the time when, in fact, the enumerators are actually face-to-face with households, right? So we do a lot of that. We bring in new technologies in terms of mobile phone surveys for specific kinds of data, and so on. So things like labor statistics are actually quite amenable to mobile phone surveys, frankly. We also encourage open data. So I call that an innovation for not necessarily obvious reasons, but I think open data is actually quite crucial for 3 reasons, right? First of all, it provides credibility to the statistical agency, right? Dr. Yemi, Kale talked a lot about the kind of pressures he doesn't face and the ones that indirectly he faces, which is financing. Now, look, the reason why I think credibility for statistical agencies is important is because informational asymmetries are incredibly enormous here, right? So think about a car. You go and buy a car, and if in fact the airbag doesn't work, all right, that doesn't have to happen to you individually to find out that in fact the airbag doesn't work. It just needs to happen to someone else who used that model on that car for you to find out almost immediately that maybe the airbag in your car is faulty. It's not the same thing with statistics, right? It's a very, very different animal. So that's why I think putting out the statistical sources, methodologies, and the assumptions that are made out there in the open for verification by a large number of users is very, very important for the credibility of the statistical agency. So we encourage them to do this quite for obvious reasons. Then the second reason is because of what Dr. Yemi Kale said, which is this is important for citizen engagement, for accountability of governments, and so on and so on. And the final reason is because it's actually have huge spillovers in terms of knowledge production. So, and this is my last point. I happened to attend a conference recently in Oxford. This is the annual conference on development, African development, called called African Development Conference on African Development organized by the Center for the Study of African Economies. Sorry, the CSAE. Lots of acronyms here. So it's a big conference, right? It's one of the largest concentrations of researchers on African development in economics that gather annually. So it happens around March. So those of you who are interested in submitting papers, remember this. There were about, just for 2 areas of research, right? So there are 300 people who are attending and most of them presenting. For 2 areas of research, agriculture and poverty, and I'm mentioning this because these are 2 important social indicators or economic indicators that I care about. There were about 50 or so papers that were presented. And 23 of those relied on a series of surveys that the World Bank and the Gates Foundation jointly implement, called the LSMS ISA, Living Standard Survey, Living Standard Measurement Surveys, Integrated Surveys of Agriculture. So they have a very high focus on agriculture, right? So that's what they use. So it's a huge number that's relying on this. And that's partly because these surveys are available openly online right now. If you can go download them, right? They are panel surveys, very unusual in that sense, for 8 countries in Africa. Nigeria is a participant of this. And they are very well implemented because it's statistical agencies, together with the technical team from the World Bank, do a lot of legwork in promoting this. And of these 18 countries where this poverty and agriculture surveys was done, only 2 were non-LSMS ISA countries, only 2. And that's Kenya and Ghana. And that's because they too have panel surveys that are publicly available. So this is why it's really worthwhile putting these data sets into an open forum, open space for people to use. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Dublin. I'm going to invite Roberto Rosales from the IMF to the platform. He's the Deputy Director of the Statistics Department. Mr. Rosales, please.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to talk to us about what the IMF can do to support better data in future for a few minutes. Thank you.
I am going to do exactly, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. And particularly, I'm delighted to be here when 2 distinguished colleagues have made 2 excellent presentations. And maybe I will start with that before telling you what we do in the IMF and we are planning to do. I would like to react to some of the things that Yemi, Kale, and Morten, Jerven have said. I found Yemi Kale particularly refreshing because he's telling us things that are extremely important. The topic of statistics is a very complex topic, and there are some facts that we need to keep in mind when we think about what is happening in Africa and elsewhere. I think both of them told us that there has been a tremendous increase in interest on statistics. And the idea is that this interest is coming from investors and from the public, investors is clear in the case of the public because of political, a stronger political debate. This is very important. However, I would like to suggest that this is not a regional story. This is a global story. You see the same thing in Latin America, you see the same thing in Asia, and you're beginning to see the same thing in the Middle East and Central Asia. So these are things that we see everywhere. It is true that as we have been told by Professor Jerven, the question of African data has been with us in recent years. But the very same questions can be seen in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in Central Asia, and certainly in many parts of Latin America. This is not a regional story, it's a global story. And so in all of this, what is driving this greater interest is certainly the revolution in communication. The fact that now, as we have been told, it is easier for everyone to access data of every kind. That data produced by the official sources, that is the National Statistical Office, the Central Bank, the Ministry of Finance, and other ministries, as well as by other entities. That is very important. I also like very much Yemi Kale focus on the funding of statistical programs. This is extremely important. It's very interesting that you said that while in the case of Nigeria there is no interference on the part of the authorities into the office, that still the fact that the government controls the funding is something that we need to take into account. It reminds me of what is said in the United States about the power of Congress. It's the power of the purse. That is normal. That happens everywhere. The other interesting issue that you mentioned is that is the perception of the data. When you like the data, you think it must be well done. When you don't like the data, it must have problems. This is also very important. It's a normal reaction to data, and it is something that sometimes colors the way we perceive a problem. And I would say that in the case of Africa, this is very important. And I turn now to Professor Jerven. I totally agree with him. I think the real tragedy here, and this is, again, I emphasize, it's not a tragedy only focused on the problem of African data, but it's a tragedy that applies in many respects, is the fact that working with data requires time, which is what is scarce in today's world. People don't like to spend time on anything, much less on data because it is boring. So going and checking, as you said, that the GDP was calculated on the basis of 1993 methodology, what does that mean? It requires to go, to take another step and find out what that means. How does that compare to, another more recent methodology? And it takes time. People get very upset. Not only, by the way, people in the public or in the, international community. Also, I can tell you, inside the IMF, okay? Inside the IMF, there is a tremendous, there has been for over 40 years, a lot of anxiety as to why this data set on fiscal affairs in Nigeria is different from this other data set. Why can we not use the same numbers? And obviously, while the first reaction is, this is impossible, we are doing something wrong, right? What is really necessary is to understand, as you say, is to take the time to see why are these two sets different. Who is using what recipe? This is essentially, because the other important thing that Professor Jerven is saying, which is crucial here, and unless you understand this, you're going to be confused, is that statistics are not facts. They are constructs that are put together on the basis of recipes. And there are many recipes you can use. You can eat chicken in many ways, okay? And so unless you understand what recipe has been used, as he says, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to be confused. This is something very important. Finally, my final reaction to Professor Jerven's points is something also very important. He was pointing to the fact that this interest in data in Africa also, he was saying, is being driven by investor interest. And he was wondering what might be what I would call the data gaps premium, okay? If you are an investor and you want to invest in something, you want to know the dynamics of this, either the stock market or the bonds that they are placing in international markets, you want to understand. And before the crisis, I would submit to you, investors were more interested in data than they are now. Why? Because interest rates have been reduced so much in main markets that now in what they call search for yield, people don't really care. We have in the IMF, in the African region, 23 countries that have placed bonds in international markets since 2004. 17 of those placed it after the crisis, after 2009. I would bet that it would have been either more difficult or they would have had to pay a higher premium if the question of the lower interest rates would not be here. To illustrate this, let me say that recently I asked for some research, and we went and looked at the prospectuses, that is the documents that underpin the placement of bonds in international markets for a number of African countries. It was not uncommon to see a text that said data are unreliable or non-existent. And yet, the bond was way oversubscribed. Okay, so that point, the point of the data gaps premium, is a very relevant point, because the moment the monetary conditions normalize, that is going to change. Okay, that was my reaction to that. Now let me tell you what we do. In the IMF, we do a number of things about the statistics. Perhaps one of the most important things we do is we produce methodologies, these recipes I was talking to you about. The IMF is responsible for the methodology for the monetary and financial statistics, government finance statistics, balance of payments, international investment position, and we also participate with the broader international community in the system of national accounts. And here I like to again agree with Yemi Kale, who essentially suggested that having the best data or improving your data is a moving target. You are totally right, because these recipes are constantly changing. Every 10 to 15 years there is a new manual, and so people try to do better. And so it's compiling statistics is a very expensive thing, and this is something that we need to recognize. And those who are richer have an easier time staying on current than the others. This is very important, and so therefore, yes, unfortunately, the structure of the economy is changing all the time. Methodologies are trying to reflect that, and in order for countries to be to be current with the methodology, they need to make investments. And in countries that are not very rich, obviously, the question of the statistical function has to compete with other priorities. Now, the second thing we do is we do capacity development. We provide technical assistance and training for those compiling statistics in our member countries. And I am happy to say that the largest recipient of IMF technical assistance is precisely the African region. In fact, over 60% of all our assistance goes to the Africa region. We also do a lot of training in the African region. We have a network of 5 regional technical assistance centers, and we also have a training center in Mauritius. And in all these centers, we are constantly training, the officials in the statistical offices, ministries of finance, and central banks who are in charge of the compilation of these statistics. Let me say that obviously in the IMF, we focus on macroeconomic statistics. So for example, we would not be involved in socio-demographic statistics or or health, that sort of thing. That's important to note. Now, just as a matter of for you to consider, last year, in the fiscal year 2014, which is ending this month, we have provided 1,409 weeks of training in Africa. So our training program is extremely large. Some of the largest recipients of IMF training in the fund are from Africa. Nigeria is one, particularly in the external sector. In prices, Tanzania. In monetary and financial statistics, also Tanzania. In national accounts, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Kenya. Government finance statistics, Burkina Faso, Gambia, Nigeria. And we also, in the IMF, apart from capacity development, we have been asked by our executive board to work on what is called the Data Dissemination Initiative, which is essentially a project that started in the mid-1990s, 94, 95, after the crisis in Mexico, to try to get countries to be disciplined about publication. This is something else that Professor Kale said, and that is that it is very important to put data in the spotlight and to put it under the microscope. And only when you publish the data in a disciplined way, you allow the public at large to see what you're doing, to make comparisons, and to then draw attention to deficiencies that may exist. This is the purpose of this initiative. My department is going to make a presentation to the executive board on May 1, where we are going to be proposing a reform of this initiative. And the reform essentially is very important for Africa and other countries that are lots of compilers that are lagging behind in terms of dissemination. We're going to propose a new way to get countries to dedicate more resources to disciplined publication. When I say disciplined publication, what I mean is that the countries commit themselves to publish data according to an advanced release calendar. And for that, we're going to try to put this issue in the context of the Article 4 policy dialogue. As you know, the IMF has at least once a year a visit to a country where there is analysis and conversations about the conditions, and we want to make it part of that conversation, precisely to raise awareness among policymakers, the Minister of Finance, who is the one signing off the budgets, that this is very important. I think this is all. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
What? Let me do an announcement about overrunning.
Okay, go ahead.
Just before Amanda takes the podium, I just want to say that we've had some fantastic presentations. It does mean that we are overrunning. We want to leave some time for Amanda to speak and also to get some questions. So if no one has any objections, I suggest we actually do overrun, so we can get those questions in. If you need to leave, please do so quietly and unobtrusively to the side. But for now, let me invite Amanda Glassman, the Director of our Global Health Policy Initiative, and also with her data hat on today, to talk to us about potential problems you see and solutions as well.
Okay, thanks, Rajesh. And thanks. This is actually quite an exciting announcement that our colleague from the IMF has just indicated to us about a commitment to release data in public as part of the Article 4 agreements that they would sign with countries. I think that's great news. So I just wanted to say something about a working group that we ran here at the Center for Global Development between 2013 and 2014 with a civil society group based in Kenya, the African Population Health and Research Center. Because we identified 3 what we called political economy problems that are underpinning some of the challenges that we've talked about today. So first, there's this issue of funding insufficiency. In general, people say that there's about 2% of ODA that's dedicated to data. We can quibble about that number, but the bottom line is that there is not adequate budget to do all of the good things that we'd like to do to really populate the source data for national accounts in the right way, to generate information to fill data gaps in areas like gender or labor market participation. And the other aspect of this is that many of the national statistical organizations in the region are totally dependent on external donor funding for almost everything except for salaries. So between 60 to 80% of NSO budgets, not counting Nigeria and South Africa, can be really funded by these external sources. And that leads to some interesting decisions in terms of resource allocation. And I'll give you an example. Not to say that one area is less important than the other, but just to give you a sense of the different issues at play. So for example, Kenya is measuring contraceptive prevalence using mobile rapid turnaround household surveys every single year, but lacks accurate administrative data on agricultural yields, despite the fact that 3/4 of Kenyans depend on agricultural income for their well-being. And in fact, for the past 20 years, about 70% of household surveys in Kenya are related to health. It's not a mistake that the issue that looks at the middle class in the Journal of Development Studies is using a demographic and health survey to try to estimate the middle class. That's not to say that the DHS and health surveys are not really important, great things to do. But I think you can see that this kind of order of priority is somewhat skewed. And then we complain that economic statistics or labor market data is inaccurate. So the issue here is that we need to support national statistical production in a more balanced way, addressing gaps and giving at least equal weight to all of these different issues. I'm also a little worried, just as a footnote, this was not something discussed by the working group, that the LSMS is mostly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. That says something about how fragile this essential source of data is. So I think we should also think about how we want to fund these essential household survey programs going forward. Great that a private foundation wants to help, but should we be reliant on a private foundation for this essential public good? Second is the issue of weak administrative data. People have already said here how great the progress has been on population censuses and household surveys. But there's been very limited attention to the coverage and quality of administrative data, which is actually the main source of information for a policymaker in a day-to-day way. You know, household surveys are available, with the exception of that contraceptive prevalence survey that I just mentioned, but they're available about every 3 to 5 years. There's a lag in the publication of data. They tend to be representative at a national level or maybe a state level, but they are certainly not representative at the level of budget authority, which is where decisions about resource allocation and policy are really taking place. And the other problem with this is that administrative data from many sources can be inaccurate. Our paper in JDS deals with this issue, and it has to do with the financial incentives that data producers are facing, especially in the sectoral ministries. In Tanzania, for example, agricultural extension workers are charged with collecting information on agricultural yields, but are also compensated based on the size of those agricultural yields with predictable results. This is a story about pay for performance gone wrong. Now, you know maybe at CGD that we love pay for performance. We love cash on delivery aid. But without accurate data, this is not a good idea. So we need to think about that. Part of this is related to the limited functional independence of statistical agencies in some countries, and they lack a mandate, or perhaps they have the mandate, but they don't have the money, the backup, the political backup to oversee the accuracy of administrative statistics that are produced by other government agency or subnational entities. In the case, Yemi, Kale also mentioned this. So we need to invest more in the accuracy and completeness of administrative data and use the surveys as a tool to enhance the quality, but not to replace a good administrative data system. And finally, too many statistics are still a secret. You've made this great announcement about the public availability of economic data. But we should also say that even though there's been a lot of progress in this area, about 60% of microdata from Africa is in the public domain. That's a figure from the International Household Survey Network at the World Bank, which is actually better than most regions. Africa leads in terms of making their microdata available. But 60% still seems somewhat disappointing, given that most of these surveys are externally funded. We also found that open access data is used about 150% more than non-public microdata for obvious reasons. So what's the solution? I think there's a lot of talk about the data revolution. There was a recent UNECA organized meeting on data revolution in Africa, so there's a lot of momentum to do better. What does better mean? It means more accurate, more complete, timely, and used. I'd like to hear more talk about that, not how much stuff we put into the system, the input, the training, things like that, but instead what we're seeing as a result of the statistical systems. Obviously, countries need to fund more themselves, but in many countries, those amounts won't be very large in the short term. So donors need to step up and fund more and fund differently. So it's not enough to restate good intentions from statistical declarations that were made in Marrakesh and Busan that exhort everyone to good behavior. We'll probably see a little bit more of that at the upcoming ADIS Financing for Development meeting. But instead, I'd like to see the leading donors and technical assistance providers create better incentives for more rational and constructive support to the development of official statistics. We propose a specific solution. It doesn't have to be that solution, but it's along the lines, actually, of what Roberto talked about and what Andrew talked about when he talked about using Program for Results, which is a new lending instrument that the World Bank has. It basically says governments already have a national statistics development strategy. Ideally, it's costed and prioritized. So could a lead donor, say the World Bank or DFID, agree with government on a program of funding that would disperse in part against progress on the accuracy, completeness, timeliness, and open availability of priority data? And there could be matching funds to create incentives for governments to contribute more of their own funding as well. This could also be a publicly celebrated contract because civil society and media need to be here with this contesting or asking or watching role that they play. And you could imagine them documenting and tracking and evaluating progress that could be made against this contract. So with that, I'll end and maybe now turn to the audience for a couple of questions and answers. We're now exactly at 11:30. Thank you.
Great, so we're going to open up to questions now. I'm going to invite Professor Jerven and Dr. Kale back to the stage and ask you, if you'd like to ask some questions, to raise your hand. We have some microphones going around. I'll take a few questions and then we'll get some answers. So, gentleman in the green tie, first of all.
It's John Hickling, a friend of CGDO's visiting fellow here, but for many years at the IMF, looking at some of these issues. I have a question on accountability. Okay, is that better? Okay. I have a question on accountability and governance, because that came up and it's a very important issue. One of the major developments following the Asia and Latin American debt crisis was to set up the special data dissemination standards at the IMF, and with a lot of help from other agencies. Is there an equivalent on the social data dissemination, where there are standards that could in some sense be agreed upon that individual statistical officers could pursue? And if so, what would be the governance structure to do that, such that, I mean, some of the problems mentioned in Nigeria, where the individual country priorities are not necessarily those that would be seen by others. So that's my question.
Okay, let's take another one. Sir, down here. There's a microphone coming to you.
My name is Mathieu Yansane. I'm a consultant in Africa. I'm not going to name the country right now. I'm a little bit worried about, the things that I've heard here, namely the lack of motivation from policymakers in Africa to take ownership of the need to mine and manage, record, keep data, right? I got the impression here that they are mostly motivated by the need to receive funding, right? So that worries me, because as long as the data mining and management of it is predicated on the financing that World Bank representative, I don't remember his name, talked about things like financing, technical support, methodological innovation, things that Professor Kale talked about that touch issues of accountability, transparency, and government. I'm a little worried because...
Do you have a question, sir?
Yeah, the question is, how do you get from here to there? You know, from this issue about data and improvement of the data. How do you get from here to there? I'd like to hear from the IMF who says about something that has to do with disciplined communication. A little more about that.
Okay, well, why don't we actually start with taking the answer to that question first. Mr. Rosales, I believe that was aimed at you.
No, discipline, as John Hicklin said a moment ago, we have as we have had until recently a governance system whereby about 70 countries have committed to publish macroeconomic data according to an advanced release calendar. That is, you know what day of the month data are going to be published. That's what this means. That exists in what is called the Special Data Dissemination Standard, the SDDS. What we want to do now is to have the same in a lower standard, which is actually observed by most countries in Africa, which is the General Dissemination System. That's the reform we are going to make.
I feel you probably answered both questions there, really. Amanda, do you want to chime in?
No, just to say, I think it's a really interesting idea to have an SDDS or a GDDS. It's the General Data and Dissemination Standard that the IMF has for other kinds of statistics as well. I don't know of any international organization that's leading on that idea right now, but I think it's a good one.
Yeah, if I can, under this proposal, while we would still be focused on macroeconomic statistics, the platform for dissemination, something called the National Data Page or Summary Page, will be available for countries to also disseminate sociodemographic indicators linked to the SDGs, but with timeliness and periodicity that would be at the discretion of the authorities.
Let's get a couple more questions. Gentleman over there in the striped shirt, and then the lady in front.
My name is Akin Sawyer. I work with the company called Market Atlas. We're a data provider on African data. The question I have is around sort of looking at sustainability and engagement of the private sector and civil society in terms of data gathering. I mean, we've heard a lot of conversations around engaging the public sector, right? So statistical bureaus. But in Africa, Nigeria specifically, there are many private sector participants that are leveraging technology to gather lots of interesting data around transactions, mobile payments, and I believe this has a role in thinking about the future of how we collect data. So I'd like to know from anyone who's willing to answer in the panel, how are we looking at engaging civil society, engaging the private sector to develop sustainable ways to gather data, to share data, to disseminate data, and also importantly, to validate the data, because there have been conversations around the source. And I think it's critical because people use sources as a shortcut to make a determination of whether data is good or not, right? So the IMF putting a stamp on a data set means a lot to foreign participants. So if you kind of speak to those issues, it'd very helpful.
Okay. And if you could pass the microphone to the lady in front as well, we'll take a second question.
His question was very similar to mine.
Okay, maybe there's another one. Gentleman here. Just wait for the microphone, please, sir.
Thank you very much. Misha Balkindas from Open Data Watch. It's a fascinating discussion, and thank you very much. It's very interesting. But let me just add a little bit more problems. I think you are absolutely right, and it's probably good that we start from when we say it's a tragedy, and then everybody jumps in and start looking, and this is And then somebody says it's a renaissance, and it's great. But now let's go to the source. I mean, we today we mentioned Nigeria, Ghana when they re-estimated their national accounts. For whatever reason, there was no noise in the world when China re-estimated their national accounts after they did the enterprise survey, and they bumped it up by 18%. And kind of it went almost unnoticed. Now in Africa, it was now, if we talk about statistics which were still missing, the IMF representative was telling us that, and Professor Jerven, that to estimate the GNP, it's not science, it's arts. And if you are clever and you put it together, you may have a reasonable estimate. However, the sources, the data sources in many countries in Africa are still not there. So we're talking about agricultural surveys, which we have a humongous problem because you have big part of the economy is agricultural economy, and we don't have data. We are talking about increasing service sector, and we don't have data. So the problems are increasing. I mean, they're not going away. And if we will put together, in addition to that, we need business registers and so on and so forth. Only then we will get good national accounts. Now, why are we only focusing on Africa? Of course, one is not enough funding, and second is 50 plus countries. I mean, it's huge, right? Now, I think we need to start looking at other parts of the world as well, because other parts are not as much noticed, but they are even more closed than the Africa. Africa is starting opening the statistics. I mean, thanks to the countries and thanks to African Development Bank. But what comes to my mind is Middle East. I mean, we need to start talking about, I don't know, what is a tragedy or whatever. So any thoughts about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the first question about engaging more the private sector in data gathering and validating data. On the data gathering point, perhaps Andrew Darbalan from the World Bank, you have some thoughts on that point, and then Dr. Kale, I'll ask you to talk about validating data that comes from other sources.
On gathering the data, you mean Misha's question or?
No, the first question about engaging the private sector more.
Look, I don't have anything intelligent to say except that
I think you do.
except that I think there are many ways in which private sector actors can actually help statistical agencies if there is an establishment of trust between them. One of the big problems that I see is that there are these laws that prohibit private sector actors from actually publishing data that will be considered official. And then that becomes some kind of a constraint on how actually they can work together. But there is nothing that stops statistical agencies from collaborating with private sector actors in order to help them actually gather certain information that they're better placed to do so. So I'm thinking specifically about things like telecoms, right? Financial sector. So some of the sources for even making better information about, better accounting for national accounts could actually come from private sector actors. But that's something that someone like Yemi could take initiative to engage in. That would be my point.
And Dr. Kale, if we can get you to pick up on that point, if you were to get data from private sector sources, how would you feel about that? How would you feel about validating that data?
Well, I'm not sure how intelligent what I'm going to say is, but I'll say it anyway.
Okay, we're all really smart. Don't worry about it.
Actually, to say that, yes, that is correct. The statistical law in Nigeria, for example, prohibits private sector from publishing data on a national scale. What they say is if you want to publish data or to gather data that will be published as official statistics on a national scale, you have to approach the statistics office and tell them that this is what you're going to do, and we have to ensure that the methodology is in line with international best practice, and work together. And we've done that several times with the private sector. What we find is that, for example, you see a sector, I don't want to call any names, I say a sector lead. coming to want to get data. Now, when he's not coming to collect the data to share with the other his competition in the sector. So he's bringing his money to work with us to gather the data, but he puts a little clause that says when this data is published, you can't make it available to his competition, because why would he want to pay for his competition and get important market research? He doesn't want to do that. So we get a lot of data like that, but we can't publish because they retain ownership of the data. So what we are trying to do, what we do now, actually, we already start working with the private. We approach, for example, the Bankers Committee in Nigeria, a few other agencies, civil society, and say, look, you have the funds, you need the data, we don't have the funds, we are happy to get you the data, and then we work together, we publish a lot more. I think that's why we find that a lot of our data the volume of our data is increasing because we are interacting more. So the problem is not whether we would accept the data from the private sector, as long as whichever agency in the private sector is approaching the statistics office before the data is collected and saying, look, we want to get this data, this is what it's going to take, and so on. We work together, and we get the data. We have no problem doing that. We're actually doing that, and we'll continue to do that.
Okay, let's move to the other question, which was about the fact that if even though the intentions are there, the data sources might still not be. I wonder, Professor Jerven, do you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think we can talk about methods and recipes all day long, but the final data estimates is not going to be any better than the raw data that is available. As I said, the demand is very much to, even if there is a public, well-prescribed, agreed-upon dissemination schedule, that still leaves the statistical office in the tight corner when having to produce data on, whatever you can make do with. So we should be very careful about balancing supply and demand here and asking what could be reasonably asked. And I think that's one of the very interesting kind of challenges through the so-called data revolution, where we think that more is better always, but that more is better is mainly on the demand side, and we're not thinking clearly through how on earth that should be met and it has to be met on earth. Maybe big data could be a lot of things, new innovations, measuring this and that from space. There still has to be some kind of validation at the statistical office. And if we think about statistics as a public good, then there can be a tragedy of the commons, that you've been pulled to one direction to another, which is exactly what Amanda talked about. And I think, whereas that kind of terrain between what should be provided by civil society, statistical office, what should be official, what should be data, what should be funded by international organizations, naturally is an evolving kind of thing, but we have to bear in mind that we're not only just getting excited about demanding more evidence as if it just comes from nowhere.
Let's see if we've got time. Let's take two more questions. Gentleman here in the second row, and then lady over there as well.
Hi, my name is Meshri. I'm a graduate student. I have a question. At the very beginning, everybody mentioned how Africa is a heterogeneous group of countries, and we've heard about a very good example of where, like Nigeria, where data is improving. And I would just like to hear an example of a bad example of where data is not improving, and how actually bad does it get? And so that's my question.
Okay, let's see if we can get an answer to that one. Madam.
Hi, thank you. Is that on?
Yeah.
So my name's Natasha Gilbert, and I'm a reporter for the Science and Development Network. My question is, it seems that the main message from the panel today is that the data actually isn't that bad. What we have of it, there's more of an issue around how you collect it, how you measure it, how you use it. But it seems that most of the proposals to address this, and Amanda, you mentioned one, focus on a revolution in the production of data. But what about a revolution in the users of data? What proposals could you make there?
Okay, two good questions. The first one, anyone care to give us an example of a country that's doing badly in terms of data?
I will highly recommend this book called Poor Numbers. How we're misled by African development statistics and what to do about it. I tell a lot of anecdotes and also sometimes even sprinkle those anecdotes with some reliable evidence about how certain statistical offices have faced very dire constraints and gone very far down below. I think in the book, maybe the most dire example I describe is maybe from Uganda, when Idi Amin burns down the statistical office, and I think it doesn't get much worse than that. So.
Yeah, but if you are interested in a current example,
then maybe Eritrea.
I mean, it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, there are countries where we don't. I mean, you can almost certainly guess that a country like Somalia and Eritrea doesn't have a lot of data, right? But if you remove yourself from that context, most likely you are thinking about countries that are just a notch also fragile, like Central African Republic. DRC has made some progress, but their census is about a quarter century old, or older than that. They've had a couple of surveys, decade apart. So so that's an improvement, but that's about as much as we know about DRC. So they're very serious cases. Even in countries which do very well, supposedly, if you take specific statistics, they're really, really not particularly great. So it all varies.
Yeah. I think I want to, I think you said using Nigeria as an example of a place where data is improving. Actually, we would also use Nigeria as an example of a place where data is also not improving, depending on the kind of data you're referring to. Yeah. I'm saying, what I mean is that overall, things are improving, but depending on the particular indicator, I would take population, for example. The incentive to get the population numbers wrong is very high because it's tied to revenue allocation. So every state government has the incentive to add a few more millions to their state population, because that's going to determine what you get. So when it comes to population data, we're having a lot of challenges there because there are a lot of, should I call them perverse incentives? People are meant to believe that you are helping your state of origin. So if I live in, say, I'm trying to use an equivalent in the US now, if I live in Washington, but I grew up in New York, once there's a census, I'm encouraged to go to New York because I'll be helping to push up the numbers of my people in New York so they can get more money, even though I actually live in Washington and the resources that takes care of me should come to Washington, but I'll go to New York for the census, and as soon as it's done, I come back to Washington, and then that's why you hear a state in Nigeria, a Lagos state, that would say they have 20 million people, that's the state government, but during the census, it goes down to 10 because everybody goes out and then come back in. And the Lagos state government is saying, well, look, I have to take care of 20 million people with a population, and you're assuming that I have a population of 10 because everybody goes out and comes back in. So I think, again, it depends on, your question was across countries, but I think even within countries, depending on the particular indicator, some have improved significantly. And that was the point I was trying to raise, that depending on who is providing the funding, for areas of interest, the data is improving. For areas where there's lack of interest in data and they're not providing funding, then those indicators seem to either stay as they are or get worse.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say, I mean, I think this is a global issue. I mean, a very interesting example is Argentina, a very wealthy country, seems to have had problems recently with its inflation rates. And you could ask also how the international organizations have reacted to that problem. We could discuss that in a separate panel. They recently announced they're no longer going to calculate poverty because it's too complicated. What are we doing about that? So it's not, it's a problem that's general. That means that, this is high politics. Statistics is high politics, and I think people have not paid enough attention to that. This issue around counting the number of people in a given subnational entity because it forms the basis of your allocation of revenues is huge. In India, they were still using the 1972 population census as the basis for distribution until, trying to correct at the margins in creative ways. But, this is a huge problem. I don't want anyone to leave thinking we have all the data. I think the important thing is that there has been a great progress on household surveys and censuses, but as Misha spoke about, there's issues with the labor market, with gender, with ag. I mean, you name it. There are a lot of data gaps, and a lot of these things are really essential inputs to the national accounts and the calculation of GDPs, business registers. So, as you're saying, you can make a lot of recipes, but unless the source data is good, we're not going to produce something that's as accurate as it possibly can, even though it's a construct. Did you know? I feel like we're all existentialists. I like the idea of facts, but it's okay.
And on
But coming to your question about how do we revolutionize use,
Yeah, that's important.
and that's actually a fundamental issue in data in this data that is being produced. But
do you have any solutions?
So my view about this stuff is that supply creates demand. No, let me be as an economist, I guess that's usually unusual, but actually in the case of data, supply really creates demand. And I gave you this example, which is written in a blog called Development Impact that the World Bank puts up by a colleague of mine called Marcus Goldstein, who looked at the kind of use that is made in these conferences, right? And I gave you this example where in terms of agriculture and poverty, a lot of the data, a lot of the papers that were produced and were used in very creative ways came from data that is actually out there in the open that people have access to. So one of the ways to revolutionize use is actually to create open data systems. Is to commit, for statistical agencies to commit to open data, to share their data openly in public. And I mean, I would like to actually point out that Nigeria is one of those countries in Africa that have actually made an effort to do that. So you can actually go and download some of the household surveys in Nigeria. That's what I know. And a lot of other economic statistics. And there are a few other countries that have followed that. But that's one way to do it. The censuses are out there in the open for some 18 countries. And they're used a lot in research, in all kinds of policy decisions, and policy analysis and so on. So I think to me, that would be one of the obvious ways to actually create demand for statistics.
Roberto Rosales.
Yeah, not just two things. I think education certainly is important, and events like this go a long way. Also, good journalism is very important because as Professor Jerven said, contesting and quizzing the data are key. This is key. And when you're doing some, in the media, because of the nature of the media, everything is a horse race. But giving always the source, mentioning what the issues may be with the source, alternative sources, that's very important.
Professor Jerven, you wanted to make a final point?
Yeah, no, as well relating to the use of data and how that also relates to accountability. So even when we start producing the data, very often it has a particular use in mind. And I applaud when open data is being used by scholars and researchers. But as Amanda as well reminded us, there is also certain types of data are useful for the policymaker. Certain other data are useful for donors here in town, and others are useful for citizens and so forth. And so we have to make sure that we're actually creating and at least not distorting an enabling environment in which policymakers can be held accountable. So if you have a poverty survey that is 3 years later than whatever, that doesn't necessarily feed into the accountability circle of what the Ethiopian leadership is doing. It's not their data, they're not responsible for that rate, and it's available 3 years later than they anyhow should have gone out of government. Yeah, so you have to think about which ways you can actually make that word meaning. How can you go from counting to accountability, and then you have to think about which of these feedback loops you are investing in. If you're investing in a knowledge function that allows us to know something about poverty there, that's very different than one that enables citizens to say something about unemployment yesterday. And I think that's key to thinking forward about it.
Okay, I think on that point, I'm going to have to let you all go now. I've kept you longer than was billed, but I'm sure you'll agree it was definitely worth it. So panellists, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you.